Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be starting a new series on one of the more significant candidate tournaments that's happened in recent history. If you're not familiar with the Candidates Tournament, the winner of that tournament goes on to play for the World Championship versus whoever is the current world champion at that time. And in 1971, we had something that now we look back at and know is one of the more important world championships in 1972. But 1971, the Candidates Tournament, we had the Russians dominating the chess world. From 1963 to 1969, we had Petrosian, the Russian, who was the world champion, and he was just defeated by Bobby Fischer. And so because Petrosian was defeated, he goes into the Candidates Tournament, and the Candidates Tournament is different than how it is now. Now you have a group of players, and they all play each other, and at the end, whoever has the most points is victorious. Back in the day, you actually played a tournament, and so on one side of the bracket, you had Petrosian, who had been the world champion for 7 years, had just lost it to Bobby Fischer. He dominated his bracket, but on the other side of that bracket, we have a young 28-year-old Bobby Fischer from America. He dominated his bracket just as much. He won 6-0, 6-0 in his 2 matches. And so we have the finale here with Bobby Fischer, 28, going off against the Russian Petrosian, 42 years old, who's really just trying to get back to what he feels like is his world championship. He defeated Bobby Fischer before that, and he just lost the title to him. But he has had the reign in Russian chess for many years and trying to get that back. So we'll go ahead and get started here with game number 1. But that's some background on why this match is so historic. So many people talk about the 1972 World Championship, but not as many people give as much credit to how important this Candidates Tournament is. So we're going to do that, starting off with game number 1. Bobby Fischer has the white pieces, and Petrosian has the black pieces. Bobby Fischer starts out with e4, and then c5, the Sicilian defense, knight f3, e6, and then pretty common, familiar opening from the Sicilian defense from white side. With d4, we see the exchange after knight to d4. This is where things get a little bit different than what we're used to seeing. Knight to c6, and then knight to b5. Almost everyone is playing knight to c3 here. But knight to b5 starts to put a lot of pressure on black right away. And one of the threats, because black may be tempted to play a6, is knight to d6. This is check, forcing black to make a move here. Usually just going to respond with the bishop taking. Really has to do that. After the queen takes, just putting a lot of pressure on black. He cannot develop his light square bishop how he would like to. If he wants to get his knight involved into the game, you could see knight to c3. White has just a lot more options that he can go with. Maybe queen to e7, trying to force something. You could see an exchange or the queen just to come back here. Maybe queen g3, attacking the pawn up here. White definitely has a good game. So black usually is going to respond with d6, so that if there is an exchange here, then the queen cannot come up here. It's now protected by the queen on d8. And that's exactly what we see in the game. D6, and then Bobby Fischer plays bishop to f4. Now, what's interesting in this spot is most players are going to respond with knight to c3. And this is a very different position. If you kind of look at this, black does not control this 5th rank right here. So usually black is going to respond with a6, and white can freely bring his knight back here to d4. Now in the game, Bobby Fischer did bring his bishop out here to f4. And now after pawn to e5, the bishop comes back to e3. Now why is this significant? Because now we have knight to f6. This is threatening this pawn. Bobby Fischer would like to play knight to c3, but this is an issue because after a6, the knight can't come back to c3, and it can't come back to d4 because now this pawn here is on e5. Whereas before, the knight could easily come back here to d4 because there was no pawn. And so he'd be forced to come back to a3. Not exactly what Bobby Fischer wants. This is not where you want your knight. So that's definitely not the position that Bobby Fischer is looking for. So he doesn't play knight to c3. Instead, he responds with bishop coming back to g5. So yeah, he's moving that bishop around quite a bit, but now pinning down the knight to the queen. Bishop to e6, and now we see knight c3. Not my favorite move because of what we already talked about, and that's exactly what Petrosian played, and that is a6. And then we do see an exchange here on the king side. Pawn recaptures, but then the knight's forced to come back here to a3. Now, from Black's standpoint, he may decide that he doesn't want to castle on the king side anymore. He's given up protection on the g file. But on the queen side, he does have some opportunity to really put a lot of pressure on white, since one of his knights is completely out of the game right now. Petrosian continues with d5, and this is really opening up the door for the dark square bishop to come in and take here on a3. Give his opponent double pawns on the a file. Definitely the last place you want to have a double pawns. Now the pawn captures. Black is down in material, but he does feel confident that he can come down, take with his bishop here, and eventually get that pawn back. Black can't take this pawn in the center. Bishop takes, knight takes, can't recapture. It is protected by the queen. So this is all setting up for the bishop to come down here. Pawn takes on a3, and then the queen to a5. And now if you kind of look at this, you say, yeah, the pawn could take here, but then the queen can come down here, take the knight, and that would be check. Also attacking the rook down on a1. While couldn't really capture that right away, that's putting a lot of pressure on white. He would have to move his king to a pretty awkward position or go down a ton of material. So white's pretty much forced to play queen to d2. And now the move that all of this led up to with the initial d5 move from Petrosian, and that is castling on the queen side. This now protects these two pieces right here on a c6 and e6, because the pawn's not going to take. That opens up for the rook to come down here and take here on d2. So you can definitely tell these players really thinking at a high level, really advanced tactics to figure out this one subtle move, because he's down a pawn in material, but he knows it's pretty easy later on to capture this material back on a3, and he knows both of his pieces here controlling the center of the board cannot be captured by that pawn. Now the bishop comes up here to c4, wants to try to find a way to castle on the king side of the board, get some protection for his king, and also add some protection to this d5 pawn in the center of the board. Black brings his rook to g8, attacking the king side. Bobby Fischer really wants to castle on the king side, but he can't right away because the bishop would come down to h3. Threatening, the bishop takes on g2. It is protected by the rook on the g file. But if you just play pawn g3, then your rook's going to fall. So that's not good from Bobby Fischer. He decides to go ahead and play rook to d1. This is where I think Black let white off the hook a little bit. He had a couple moves. One, just rook takes on g2. I think that's completely fine. Then you have the white king for Bobby Fischer just stuck in the center of the board for the rest of the game, unless he wants to castle and still have a lot of attacking going on here. Or could have played knight to e7. His pieces are under attack, but this still defends and attacks the central square here on d5. Also makes it so the pawn still can't take. The queen is going to fall here. Instead, Petrosian decides to play bishop to f5. But then after bishop to d3, we just start to see some material exchange off the board. Black had a better position. He decides to go ahead and exchange. That's definitely not the recommended approach. You usually want to be pretty aggressive when you have the advantage. He decides to bring knight down here to a d4. Now we see castle on the king side. Not as many threats. He can safely do that since the bishop is off the board. King to b8. King here to h1. Wants to get it off this g file since the rook is attacking. And then we see the queen takes here on a3. Now at this point, after all those moves from 10 moves or so ago, Black finally got the material back he was trying to get back once he gave up his pawn here on a d5. So yes, he did take this pawn, but they're now equal in pawns. Black does have double pawns here on the f file, but they're in the center of the board. It's a little bit easier to handle double pawns, especially if you have a pawn connected to that. But now he needs to figure out how he's going to connect all of his pieces. You can see his queen's kind of by lonesome self right now, and the king's on the other side of the board. He does have very active rooks, though, so that's good. He does have the semi-open g-file. So from here, we'll continue. Bobby Fischer plays f4, tries to start open up the king side of the board here. Rook to c8. Knight to e4 says, hey, if you want to exchange queens on the board, and we see Petrosian say, yeah, I will absolutely do that. Bobby Fischer decides to go ahead and recapture with his pawn towards the center. Yes, they are double pawns, but in the center of the board, he's going to be looking to push these pawns, and he recognizes this is definitely the way to go with his rooks behind that. And then the rook comes down here to c2, and then rook to d2. Now, this is a great move from Petrosian. Always want to bring your rooks down and attack your second rank if you are black. But the knight here on e4 is nicely placed. No real way for Petrosian to do anything with this. He has both of his rooks blocking off a lot of the squares that black wants to attack. And so we do see the exchange right here. Now, this is where it gets a little weird for me from black's standpoint, because you generally don't want to let your opponents have central pawns. So if you kind of look at black's standpoint, you may think, okay, well, we have the pawn here on e5. If they take, okay, well, that's fine. We can recapture with our pawn. We have our rook protected, so maybe you want to play rook to e8. Maybe you want to swing it over here to d8 and start to attack your opponent's pawn. That makes a lot of sense. But instead, he went for f5, and then Bobby Fischer recaptured with f takes on e5, and now Bobby Fischer has 3 central pawns. Yes, double pawns, but that's not the worst thing ever. Both of these are pass pawns, and then we have double pawns here on the f file, but just not nearly as strong from Petrosian. Now we see the rook come over here to e8, and then the rook to e1, protecting that. So now we've entered the endgame. Petrosian plays knight to c2, attacking the rook right here. And there's 2 options. You could try to play rook to e2, or you could play rook over here to c1. Rook over here to c1, I think, is the stronger move. After this, knight comes back to d4, and then knight to c4, and there's no great moves that black can go to. The knight here has a great outpost. It's also defending this knight here on e5. How does black really continue? But in the game, Bobby Fischer decided to play rook to e2. We have some repetition here with knight to d4. And now the rook comes to e3. He had the option to just come back and do the whole thing over again, but he decided, yeah, I'll go ahead and bring my rook up here to e3. And now after knight to c2, Bobby Fischer swings his rook to h3. And what this says is, yeah, I don't mind if you gobble up all these pawns in the center of the board. And that's exactly what Petrosian did. First takes the e-pawn, then knight to f3, attacking the rook. Rook takes here on d5. And this is all to set up the rook taking on h7. So Bobby Fischer approaching the endgame, one of the best to ever play. He felt the need to go ahead and have the pass pawn on the h file. He has his rook here. He has the king here. He has his knight nicely placed, and he feels like he can win from this position. So that's why he decided to go ahead and bring his rook here. I think the other move is extremely strong, but part of chess is being comfortable and having a game plan. If you feel like you can execute that, do that, and that's exactly what Bobby Fischer did. So the rook takes here on d3, and then pawn to h4. Really, you have to do this because the rook is threatening to come down here to d1. You don't just want to have your knight coming back to the first rank. It's just completely out of the game. So decides to play h4. This is the pass pawn. You always want to be pushing your pass pawns, and he knows he can at any time take this pawn up here on f7. Knight to e3, and then the rook takes on f7, threatening this pawn on f5. It is protected right now by the knight here on e3. Rook down to d1, check. King to h2, and then rook to a1 says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and take this material right here. And then pawn to h5, and this is where things get extremely, extremely bad for black. Up until this point, he's had a pretty good game. Hadn't played flawless, and he's let Bobby Fischer back into it. But he just needs to continue and take with his rook right here. Then how does white really continue? You can't take the pawn. We've already looked at that. It's protected by the knight right here. He could play knight to h4, rook up here to a5. He has both his knight and his rook attack or defending this pawn right here. And Bobby Fischer's really playing defense right now. I think this would be a very good game. The pawn can't just come up here because knight to g4 check, and that would also fork and take the pawn here on h6. But in the game, Petrosian decided to play the very, very terrible move, f4. Bobby Fischer looked at that and said, yeah, I'll go ahead and take your free pawn, and I should win an easy game from here. And it didn't take too many moves from here for Bobby Fischer to win because it's just too late. The rook takes here on a2. Bobby Fischer plays rook to e4, attacking the knight. Knight comes down and takes the pawn, but that's okay because after king to g3, you can see there's just no strong way for black to actually get involved into the game after knight to e5. This pawn is going to push eventually, or this knight's going to fall and black's just going to be down too much material. So game 1 goes to Bobby Fischer, and if you look at the bracket, you remember he won the entire first series 6-0. Just won the first 6 matches. Second round, semifinal 6-0. Coming into this one, Petrosian, who everyone thought was going to win, been the champion for many years, trying to just get back to the world championship that he had just previously lost to Spassky. Bobby Fischer came in at 28 years old and won game 1. So hopefully you guys are excited about this series. One of my favorite ones to go over. We will be coming back shortly with game number 2 to see how the historic run from Bobby Fischer in the 1971 Canada's tournament plays out. But thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.